excellent example of what I was saying before about how our parents were pretty good at getting us to accept that these creatures were living very close by. They would always come up with a reason why we need not fear them. But sometimes that brings me to the question of what it would have been like had we resided among a large population of grizzly bears. Had that been the case, I have a feeling not all of us would have survived. There's no question that these prairie people, the Sasquatch, are highly skilled and aggressive predators capable of taking down grizzlies. However, I believe that they're also rather selective when it comes to what they eat. Based on my family's experience, they have no interest in eating humans. But there are always exceptions, and I don't think they'd hesitate to at least kill a person if they felt threatened. We were finally about to be attacked after so many years of peace. I should probably clarify how, even though we frequently saw and heard them, it was almost always a considerable distance away. As soon as I noticed the shadow looming over us, I knew it was the closest I had yet to come to one. They had always come off like they wanted to stay out of view, so I'm sure you can understand why the idea of a prairie person coming up right behind us presented an ominous vibe. It sounded like someone had started coughing through the raspiest voice I had ever encountered. Mother was the first to turn around and face whatever was responsible for the it appeared calm, just observing us from above. But things took a wild turn when my grandpa raised his rifle, perhaps to get a better look at the mysterious creatures. The moment the creature noticed the rifle, it went berserk. It shook a branch above its head until it snapped off, and then it quickly maneuvered through the forest, seemingly jumping from one branch to another, without ever turning its back to us. It just sort of faded away into the woods. After this intense encounter, my grandpa and I silently made our way back to the ranch. He was not one to talk much, usually quite stoic, but I could tell he was shaken up by what he had witnessed. At dinner with my grandma, he remained unusually quiet, which was quite out of character, especially with her barking about the dead horse. During our walk back, he told me never to tell anyone about what we had seen deeper into the cave until I saw what was making the noise. I didn't need to be an expert to know that I was looking right at Bigfoot, and I realized that I must have been near the entrance of his cave. I had no escape, and I could see his glowing eyes staring right at me. He didn't move, but instead just stayed where he was, and I stayed where I was. From what I could see, he wasn't wanting to go after me, or thought of me as a threat. I think he knew that I was lost, and just needed somewhere to sleep where I could be safe. It was nearly pitch black, but my eyes adjusted, and I could make out vague shapes of his body. I saw if I wasn't the one in the cave. I stopped telling most people about the Bigfoot part, because the more people didn't believe me, the more upset I got. I had information about one of the biggest mysteries, and I was just being totally ignored. I expect seeing the creature would have gotten me a lot more attention, but instead, it just gave me one night in a cave and memories that will stick with me for the rest of my life. Back in 2012, I went camping with a group of friends as kind of a sporadic trip. We were dumb enough to think going hiking and camping out by Mount Washington in the winter was a good idea. New Hampshire can get pretty cold, especially in the winter and at higher altitudes. We were all in our 20s and too man enough to admit and scary at the same time. This huge creature just moving along the mountain without a care in the world. One of my friends wanted to go after it, but the rest of us convinced him that that would be a bad idea. I didn't know much about Bigfoot at the time, or how dangerous it could have been. We moved as silently as possible in the opposite direction of him, and didn't dare speak until he was out of sight. And then we couldn't stop talking about what we saw, and how much money we could have made if we had a camera and gotten a photo. I was high on adrenaline, and I didn't think until days later how dangerous of a situation the four of us were actually in. We each drank another couple of beers while leaning against our four-wheelers, catching each other up on our individual lives and what our families had been up to, when I thought I noticed a human-like shape between two trees. It seemed faint enough to disregard it as a figment of my imagination, and Jimmy was talking his head off, so I returned my attention towards him. In any normal circumstance, I probably would have been a little bit more freaked out, but I was with a guy who was comfortable in those woods, and I assumed there couldn't be anything to worry about. But soon, something interrupted my confident cousin mid-sentence. "Don't move," he said so quietly that it took me a second to consider what he said. "What is it?" I asked, but he didn't reply. Instead, he slowly walked off by that point and was shutting the garage door. When the door finally closed, I was so thankful not to have seen some giant hand reaching under it. The sound of it closing was like music to my ears. I had never before heard something so relieving, and I sincerely doubt I ever will again. There was something so overwhelmingly awkward when we stepped into the house. Our families were having such a good time with glasses of wine and cheerful conversation. The contrast in their demeanors to ours couldn't have been greater. I didn't know what to expect, but it wasn't a giant beast that was living and drinking out of the river. I was only feet away from a Bigfoot, and I wasn't even breathing in fear of him seeing me. He was so massive that he could rip me in half like it was nothing and use my bones as a toothpick. If I wasn't frozen, I might have been able to hide before he turned around and locked eyes with mine. I was seeing my entire life flash before my eyes as I gazed into his. He had deep, red-colored eyes that seemed to be darker from the sun setting. His chest moved heavily with every single breath he took, and I saw water dripping down off of his face into his fur. I wish that I could have looked down to see if he was really known for his big feet. I could only guess from how the ground shook when he walked. For about 30 seconds, but what felt like an hour around Clam Lake in Cadillac, Michigan, I encountered an unidentified animal. The place was only about a 40-minute drive from where I lived, so I'd go there on occasion to see my old friend Stuart. Stuart and I were on our high school's cross-country team back in the late 90s, and we've essentially used each other for motivation to stay active ever since. We both started having knee trouble around the same time, so we decided to make bike riding our primary form of endurance exercise. Stuart lived about half a mile away from the beautiful Clam Lake, so I'd go park my car at his place and we'd ride our bikes around the lake. Back in 2011, I was out with my wife in Olympic National Park in Washington. We weren't there for camping or becoming one with nature. We were there with a mission to spot Bigfoot, and we were lucky enough to actually meet that goal. Seeing him was something that the two of us had always dreamed about.
Oh. Hey. I cannot tell what the difference is.
Clear as day.
They look pretty identical. This one right here is the refurbished.
This is the new one.
This device is the new one. So I got it right.
Because he turned around and he did not look happy in the least. He roared, and I saw his giant teeth that all seemed sharpened to a point. Spit flew from his mouth, and the only thing I could do was drop everything and run for my life. My wife wasn't noticed, so she stayed put to avoid getting the attention of the angry creature. I ran towards the nearest water source, and I jumped down into it. From past research, I found that Bigfoot will not dive into the water after anything, so it seemed to be the safest place for me. I stayed under as long as I could hold my breath before popping up and seeing that he was gone. Where I grew up, we didn't use rifles, only shotguns, so the chance to use my Winchester Model 70 was exciting. We arrived in late afternoon, and with it being so close to winter, the sun was about to set. My uncle's house was in the country, just north of Pittsburgh, and sat on 6 acres. But what made his land special was his acreage backed up to state land, giving him access to over 300 acres of pristine woods. After dinner, I settled into my room and was readying myself for sleep when a knock at my door came. It was my cousin. He was a year older, and we had always gotten along very well. I invited him in and we chatted for a bit. Before he left, he turned to me and asked me a question that I thought was odd at the time, but now I know what it meant. He asked if I'd ever seen anything weird or strange. There was something in me that said this wasn't fate. I wanted to look again, but I was too scared. This thing walked up to the base of the tree stand and was now about 12 feet below me. I kept my gaze forward, but I could feel it was looking at me. I looked down briefly, and I found it looking up at me. I about fainted, and I know I peed my pants a little, and I started to shake. As if it knew it had already scared me, this thing took terror to a new level when it let out a shriek and then smacked the tree. I couldn't bring myself to look down again. I just couldn't. I thought if I saw it again looking at me, I probably would pass out. This thing could hear something crashing through the woods to my right. I knew it was the creature. I was tempted to stop and engage it. I did have my rifle, and the rounds I had could easily take this thing down. I kept my pace, and it also kept its. I was just waiting for it to spring from the side and tackle me to the ground. I imagined it tearing and ripping me apart, even taking bites out of me with its large, scary teeth. But it never did come leaping out. It simply kept pace with me. My heart was thumping, and I could barely breathe. But it's amazing what someone could physically do when faced with possible death. Before long, I could see the edge of the woods and my uncle's house just beyond. I was almost there. It was then when I noticed I couldn't hear this creature. I don't know when it had stopped, but I no longer heard it. I burst from the woods and ran up the somehow came up. I'm not exactly sure how we started talking about all of that, but given the time of year in which this event occurred, it must have been something to do with it almost being Halloween. We were debating the legitimacy of UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, and all of that stuff, when he brought up how his friend swore he saw a pack of Sasquatch. I guess the guy had been fly fishing up in Montana when he spotted these things in broad daylight. I wouldn't have taken Josh for the type to necessarily believe these types of claims, but he insisted that his friend was not alive. He went on to say that Josh is probably one of the only people he knew.
Well, folks, that's it for this Tuesday. Still dealing with that little strain or whatever it is. I just went with sets of 15. You know, I like to go to failure on the dumbbell inclines on Thursdays, but it ain't quite there yet. So we just 15 is a good number, you know, with the 60s. It didn't burn me out or blow me out or blow me up or nothing like that, but you know, it was decent. You know, of course, I feel a little disappointed because I like to come out here and kind of, you know, I don't want to say just fucking go crazy, but you know, a little intensity. You know, by the time I walk out this motherfucker, you know, I feel like, damn, I'm fucking kind of glad that's over with. You know, but you know, I gotta let this catch up. You know, I could even see it. You know, watching it, I could definitely feel it, but I could really see it watching some of the set back on the left side. And for anybody that's curious and thinks, well, that's your goddamn right side, it's a front-facing camera. This is my left. I know my fucking left hand from my right hand. It's a front-facing camera. That's why, you know, it appears to be my right side. But yeah, it is my left side. I know that. I know it looks like I'm saying my right side because that's because it's using my phone still. It's a front-facing camera. Like I said, I decided to go 15 reps. We did 8 sets on the incline dumbbells. We paired them up with some easy bar curls. You know, 8 sets of 15 with that. Use a little wider grip because, as you know, may or may not know, easy bar, it's not a straight bar. It's got curves in it, which some places where you hold it, it makes it easier on your wrist or whatever. I chose to hold it out a little further, closer to the plates. That way you can kind of, your hand is kind of facing like this instead of like this when you're curling towards the middle. If it's like this, you're more supinated. You know, you may or may not know what that means. Supinate is that basically. If you ever do that and feel your bicep move, that's supination. So that's that. That's the workout for tonight. I ain't too disappointed. You know, like I said, I always like to go a little harder than that, but we can't right now. So it is what it is. We'll be back for shoulders tomorrow. We'll see you then. Hey, take it easy.